Hi everyone. See you slowly come in. We're gonna give it a few minutes. There's a lot of folks coming into the room right now. I'm gonna already start with a genuine welcome. Hello everyone. My name is Daan Keiman. It is really lovely to see you all. I see some familiar faces and some new faces. I'm very excited to get to know you a little bit better. However, today is going to be a lot of one direction traffic, as we would say it in Dutch. I will be talking, and you're in choice, either to listen or to just leave the room. I'm not hung up on either of those. It's a joy for me to share some of the things that are important to me and that I've been thinking a lot about. But I really want to position myself and say that these are very much my ideas, and if it doesn't speak to you, that's absolutely okay. I can often speak in a way that suggests that I'm very certain about things. That's not as much the case as it might appear. So I really invite you to just really weigh my words and see if it has any meaning for you. Additionally, I'm going to ask you to please mute yourselves. A dear friend and colleague, Sandra, is with us today as well. And I've asked her to be co-host, and so she might mute you when you accidentally unmute or when new folks come in. So yeah, as we're all collecting, I would love to do a short opening and centering. The talk I prepared is about 1 hour and 15 minutes, which is fairly long. So I would love to start with an opening and centering. And then maybe in the middle, I'll just do a brief check-in to see how you're all doing, and if my talking has not been too boring for you yet, or you need a body break. So I'll do a little bit of a check-in in the middle of the session, just to see where we're at, and then might continue, might do a short break. I will keep some time towards the end for questions. But I initially thought this would be 2 hours. So for those of you that have the luxury of time, you can linger and you can kind of stick around. For those of you that really need to go, please rest assured, we'll share the recording. You're going to get this beautiful, well-structured transcript. I don't use slides. I just talk. We'll try not to talk in a monotonous way, and then you can just take it in or take notes or not. It's going to be recorded, and so you'll have a backup. And with all of that being said, maybe briefly, especially if you've had a long day like me, I'm in Central Europe. You might just want to take a moment to find a position that is comfortable. If you want to be off camera, that's absolutely fine. If you don't want to participate, that's super okay too. And myself, I really appreciate it to take this moment to kind of like find a posture that has some dignity to it. And it feels like I can kind of ground myself. And for me, it helps to close my eyes. If it's the same for you, you could try that. I really enjoy this connecting to whatever I'm seated on. Right now it's a chair. And when I'm connecting through my body, I'm particularly feeling into what it's like to be supported. It's like to be carried. And as I sit, I notice my breath becomes a bit lower. I'm gonna take a deep breath, kind of let go some tension on the out breath. You might be very adept at contemplative practice, so if you notice that, or if you know that there's things that will help you kind of drop in, see if those are fruitful now. I really enjoy some stillness where I allow my shoulders to hang, a sense of relaxation to come into my body, but you might actually enjoy exploring movement and giving your body a bit of a stretch. Whatever it is, I encourage you to just offer to yourself what you feel you need the most. I see some people opening their eyes, which means that probably you heard the bell, but if you didn't, this is your invitation to come back. Maybe as a final heads up, I will introduce myself in a moment. I read from a text. I try to make that sound more fun than it might be, but I won't be able to see you. So if you have any questions, just please write them down and save them towards the end, or put them in the chat. Very happy to go into the chat, but will be towards the end of the talk. And then, yeah, without further ado, maybe we can jump in. Set my alarm at like 45 minutes. So we can do a little bit of a check-in. See how we're all doing. And then we'll just start. So my name is Daan Keiman, and I like to introduce myself through the relationships that I have. I'm a child and a grandchild. I'm a sibling. I'm a student. I'm a colleague. I'm a partner, a friend, a facilitator, and an educator. And before we really start today, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we're going to have a conversation about psychedelic care. While one of the largest displacement of people in human history is unfolding in Sudan, there's a genocide against the Palestinian people by the state of Israel unfolding in Gaza. And that in and of itself is a disproportionate reaction to the very horrific Hamas attack of October 7th and increases in violence against Jews globally. There are tensions, significantly and rapidly growing tensions between Taiwan and China that threaten to destabilize the entire region. And especially here in Europe, it's palpable that NATO is engaged in a proxy war with Russia in the Ukraine. And meanwhile, mental health problems, perhaps not surprisingly to most of you, are skyrocketing, and the world is kind of like looking desperately for solutions. Now, I want to bring attention to our global predicament and acknowledge that I strongly feel that our work as psychedelic practitioners in this field should address these massive challenges, and that psychedelics might be employed as a tool of resistance to, or resilience and resistance to respond to catastrophe. I will say it's one tool, it's a very small piece of a very large puzzle, and I would also hurry to say that our primary medicines, I believe, as practitioners, are the medicines of belonging and caring, not the psychedelics per se. I think psychedelics are optional and unnecessary for liberation. However, if we are serious about healing, I do think we must break with individualized notions of healing and acknowledge that so much of what we're trying to heal actually stems from these systemic dynamics, not just personal ones. And because of that, I'm currently seeking to understand how psychedelic care can be responsive to the numerous humanitarian, but also these massive ecological crises that we currently face on both a personal and a communal level. And because of that, as we talk about psychedelics and narcissism today, I will also reflect on both personal notions of narcissism, but also on what Michela Dell'Amico calls the narcissism of our culture. We did a panel on this topic last week titled Love and Grief in the Shadow of Psychedelic Narcissism, put together and organized by clinical psychologist Rosalind Watts, she brought together Brian Anderson, Laura Northrup, Michaela de Lamico, Anya Oleksiuk, Matthew Green, and myself to address an emerging problem in the field of psychedelic care. And the problem of that problem is psychedelic narcissism. And I'm inspired by that panel and would also really encourage you all to look up the other wonderful panelists. We'll definitely share their names and their work in the recordings. And I would say that the problem of narcissism knows a lot of different dimensions, and any talk on that topic, it's such a vast topic, is not going to cover all the ground. And I don't think I'm always the best person situated or to offer sort of like reflections on all dimensions of psychedelic narcissism. First and foremost, because I'm not a clinician and I have not been trained as a psychotherapist. I'm a spiritual caregiver. So whenever I'm sharing clinical insight, please understand that from someone that has had some clinical training, but not as a psychiatrist or psychotherapist. So before we start, I'd like to kind of define the problem and to outline this talk in such a way that it kind of makes sense in the sense of what I am responding to. Or to use another way of phrasing this, I want to tell you what my matters of concern are. And the first one is this, that the position of power that psychedelic practitioners hold over their clients requires an extraordinary amount of self-knowledge and ongoing self-reflection, preferably in a group and under the care of a supervisor. 2, that many practitioners have narcissistic defenses or strategies, which I will refer to as parts, and that most of those parts are not inherently bad or wrong or harmful. However, in order to mitigate their risks, we must learn to become patient and to become comfortable with the inherent anguish present in living a human, fallible, and vulnerable life. 3, that unexamined and under-examined narcissistic parts that are subclinical in their nature can actually do significant harm, even when we have the best intentions at heart. Most importantly, these parts are often rooted in what Kailea Taylor calls the healing impulse. So in order to become safe, or at least safer practitioners, we ought to dedicate ample time to study our own shadow and our own healing impulse. And 4, that the systems that we inhabit, the culture that we breathe, and the socioeconomic structure that we enact share certain narcissistic traits and favor antisocial behaviors through a very complex interplay between neoliberalism, capitalism, and individualism. And in order to insulate the field of psychedelic care against narcissism and against abuse, I think we need to build communities of care that are rooted in transparency and vulnerability. Moreover, we need to learn how to recognize the common narratives and practices that might enable abusive and harmful psychedelic practices. So that's a big thing. It's a big scope. In order to discuss these interdependent problems, I will start and end with the myth of Chiron, also known as the wounded healer. And I do this to show that most, if not all of us, both aspiring and established psychedelic practitioners, are wounded to some extent. And that it is precisely in understanding our own wounding and the nature of that wounding, and that learning to compassionately respond to it is critically important if we want to be a safe presence to others who seek to heal, if we want to formulate an antidote to our own narcissistic tendencies. So let's jump in with a myth. A long, long time ago, there was a place where gods and demigods lived close to humans, and the veil between worlds was still thin. That place was Mount Pelion in Thalassy, now known as Greece. And a titan by the name of Cronus was very unsatisfied in his marriage, and as is common with those living in the god realms, he sought after another external means to satisfy his desires. Enter Philyra, an oceanite or sea nymph. She responded really well to Cronus's advances. She was really pleased to be courted by him. But during one of their copulations, they were caught by Cronus's wife, Rhea. And fearing her retribution, Cronus transformed himself into a stallion towards the end of the sex act and then galloped away, leaving Philyra alone, but also pregnant with a half-divine, half-equine creature. Now, when she gave birth to a centaur, she was so disgusted by the creature that she abandoned her own child and begged the gods to change her into anything as long as it was not human or anthropomorphic. And Zeus changed her into a linden tree, and thus the baby centaur was completely left alone. Now, pitied upon by Apollo and Artemis, two other Greek gods, the young centaur was taught by this divine twin in both the healing arts and archery and hunting. Now, growing up without parents, the centaur's life would be characterized by being an outcast and an outsider, living alone on the edges of society. And now, as you surely know, centaurs are quite a rowdy kind, but unlike his violent and savage fellow centaurs, he became quite well known, primarily due to his mastery of the healing arts, the art of prophecy, hunting, and martial arts. And this earned him the name Chiron, which comes from the Greek karurgos, meaning steady hand, and which forms the root of the word surgeon. Now, on one occasion, late in the life of Chiron, or so some tellings of the story go, one of his dear friends, Heracles, is invited to Chiron's cave. And as a token of appreciation and hospitality, Heracles brought a flask of very heavy wine to the gathering. And once opened, the very rich and fragrant liquid attracted other centaurs who, unaccustomed to the strong wine, became drunk very quickly. And of course, they're centaurs, in their drunkenness, they start fights. So in the ensuing melee, Chiron is accidentally struck in the knee by an arrow shot by Heracles himself. Now, you might remember that Heracles is this Greek hero, the one that is known for his victorious decapitation of the multi-headed monster, the Hydra. And after he defeats the Hydra, he dips his arrows in her blood. And this is extremely poisonous. So whenever Heracles fires an arrow, he kills within a matter of minutes because the poison is so strong. So the poison should fatally wound Chiron as well, but Chiron has divine parents, and so he is immortal. Thus, Chiron is cursed with agonizing pain and wounding without being able to die or to fully heal himself. So capable of healing others, the greatest of all healers alive is unable to completely heal himself. And being immortal, Chiron is bound to live forever with his wound as the archetypal wounded healer. Now, I adapted this myth from different sources, including the book Heal Thyself, Lessons on Mindfulness in Medicine, written by Saki Santorelli. But the myth is quite well known due to the work of Carl Jung, the well-known archetypal psychologist. And he suggested that the myth of Chiron is an expression of an archetype that many healers, people that are offering care to others, that they will recognize or that they might even embody. Namely, that healers themselves are wounded, and that it is exactly their wounding that brings them to want to heal others. Although there is a lot of research that agrees with Jung and indeed suggests that many psychotherapists and caregivers are driven and motivated by their own wounding or by very difficult life circumstances, we, I think, need to acknowledge that the reasons for engaging in healing work are often much more diffuse and complex combinations of altruistic longings, but also selfish desires. So when I talk about the myth of Chiron, I do not wish to suggest that every caregiver is a wounded healer, but much more that we can use this fairly beautiful myth to reflect on our own life and to recognize those parts of us that house or hide wounding. Now, Chiron is a mythical creature. He's torn between two worlds. Immortal, he cannot be killed by the poison, but poisoned, he can never fully heal. Yet there is a blessing in this incident, for although Chiron was already a master healer, trained in the healing arts by the god Apollo himself, it is through his own personal and direct experience with incurable suffering that Chiron deepens his understanding of others' needs, what it means to bear suffering, what it means to be a patient. And he does so by observing what happens inside of himself. So he greatly increases his capacities through his forced introspection and interoception. Seeking to understand what poisons him, he learns more about the healing arts. So that's one of the first things that we can take from this myth as well. A wounded healer is someone that can help others because of their own pain and because of their own history of trauma and because of their own intimate understanding of trauma. And the word trauma comes from the Greek word for wounding. After all, Chiron's wounding happens earlier in life than the wound that is inflicted by Heracles' arrow. His mother is ashamed of him, and his father doesn't acknowledge him, so they both abandon him. Moreover, being a centaur, he lives as an outcast. Even though he's brilliant and eventually teaches many famous Greek heroes, he's treated as an outcast. So in modern language, maybe even clinical language, we would say that Chiron suffered from some very serious developmental trauma, has some attachment issues, experienced an adverse childhood event, and has been subject to systemic racism and discrimination. And so it is in this sense that what stands out for me initially in this myth is that one's personal experience with suffering can become a source of healing and transformation. Wounded healers have moved through their own suffering and transformed it. Wounded healers have found meaning in their own suffering. And as Viktor Frankl suggests in his grand opus, Man's Search for Meaning, humans have a will to meaning, which is, and I quote from his book, the basic striving to find and fulfill meaning and purpose. It's the end of the quote. So one dimension of this myth is to understand the wounded healer as someone that has transformed pain and suffering through an active process of what is called reappraisal. Basically learning through suffering and then reappraising the meaning of that suffering, giving it a new meaning. My suffering gains meaning because I can use it to help others. So an extension of that understanding is how the wounded healer has mobilized their own suffering in order to alleviate the suffering of others. It becomes actually a source of resilience and inspiration. Important to note here, though, is that this process of knowing and reappraising one's own suffering takes time. And throughout this presentation or this talk, lecture, whatever you want to call it, you will hear me come back to this notion of please take time, please go slow. Whenever I hear people have their first or second, up to their sort of fifth psychedelic experience, and then quite quickly report that the medicine told them that they need to start serving it, I recognize the archetype of the wounded healer. In all its beauty, it's right there, but also a lot of shadow. Namely, that it often results in practitioners that are spiritually and perhaps psychedelically bypassing their very real human suffering. And they're jumping too quickly to a new spiritual identity, an identity of specialness. And I'll say more about that later. These practitioners kind of unconsciously expect that this new identity will shield them from the pain of vulnerability, of ordinariness, of human messiness. So let me pause for a moment, and even before moving to a clinical definition of narcissism, which is the topic of today's talk, let me give my personal current understanding of the core tendency or the core dynamic of narcissism, which I would say is an over-identification bordering on an obsession with an inflated and external presentation of self. A performative part that hides and conceals, even to the person themselves, an internal sense of lack, a deflated sense of self, an empty void, and an unmet need. And I want to ensure that in this I depathologize the human experience at large, and narcissism is part of that. So I think that every one of us has parts and internal places of unlove and unbelonging. We all have parts and places that feel like shortcomings, that feel like we're somehow wrong, as if our most basic needs are any variation to a very theme, which is we are not okay. We're too much, we're too little, we're too weird, we're too big, too small, too sexy, too strong, too weak, too beautiful, too ugly, etc., etc., etc. Now, narcissistic parts and patterns, or defenses, if you want to use that term, from my perspective, are those tendencies that are characterized by a dual movement. On the one hand, we see a part that is pretending to feel better than, whilst, and this is the second part, feeling less than underneath. So externally there's inflation, whereas internally there's a movement of deflation and hiding or shielding that. So turning back to the myth of Chiron, we can see that these narcissistic defenses as dynamics without an endpoint. And what I mean is that the healing, that healing is not an endpoint in and of itself. Healing is a continuous process, and thus we have a choice at every single moment. Either we follow the healing impulse through wisdom and compassion towards wholeness and an integration of our woundedness, an integration of our human messiness, or we follow the healing impulse through a narcissistic part and identify with being a healer to further cover up our woundedness. So we can either become a wounded healer or we become a healer covering up our woundedness. True healing then, from this perspective, or according to me, is a continuous entering of the wound, an endless process of befriending the darkness and void and releasing any need to fend or fight. And I want to emphasize that journey and that path is filled with joy, even though I phrased it as a continuous entering of the wound. A wounded healer is never fully healed, cannot be fully healed, and acknowledges that. It's like Chiron's predicament. We always have to tend to our own wounds and the unfolding healing process because, like Chiron, we are forever poisoned. And in that sense, what marks a wounded healer is that they spend a significant amount of time tending to their own wounds, rather than pretending that the wounded healer is free of wounds or free from trauma. Rather, they acknowledge the ongoing impact of their scars, the lived experiences and memories, and the impact that those have on their everyday lives, but also on their professional practice as a practitioner. So they acknowledge their own mortal vulnerability. The master healer himself, Chiron, revered for his skills, never claimed to have fully healed his wounding because he couldn't. And so one of the most important things that I think our field needs to tell aspiring clients or prospective clients is to be wary of any healer that claims to have fully overcome their trauma, and to look for those people, and for you perhaps those mentors, those teachers, that actually accept their fallibility and humanness. Now, as practitioners, our own embodied relation to our own wounded parts, role models, how they too could show up in the face of their own emerging suffering and in the face of the somatic activation that can come from encounters with impermanence or trauma or a psychedelic substance. So the way that we show up in an embodied way reflects if we have learned to tenderly hold our own wounds. Our embodied calm invites our clients to cultivate a similarly loving relationship to both their wounds and to their reactive and narcissistic behaviors. This is important because as wounded healers, we need to understand that the reactive and potentially harmful behaviors of anyone struggling with narcissistic defenses have actually developed to avoid having to feel the pain of underlying injury and suffering. So a wounded healer has become responsive to their own body and activation and as such can truly be patient, accepting, and attuned. But going to the core wound takes a great amount of courage, and it could take many, many years of ever so slowly building trust and confidence. And it might take your clients many years, even with the support of a psychedelic substance like MDMA. It can take many years to go to the heart of anguish. And of course, in great suffering and anguish, what can happen is that we feel great urgency. We start to attune ourselves to the urgency to stop suffering. This is an important thing for me. Urgency is a dialect of reactivity. I'll say that again. Urgency is a dialect of reactivity. So whereas slow, consistent, and deliberate change is the language of responsiveness, urgency is the opposite. So sometimes urgency tells us one session of psychedelic therapy is akin to 7 years of therapy. It's urgency. Because it doesn't substitute the 7 years of slow everyday change. And I'm suggesting we can have 7 years of therapy in one experience and then still have to do 7 years of everyday slow change. And this is why I think we must take heed and take care to listen to Bayo Akomolave's wisdom for our age. The times are urgent. Let us slow down. When we as practitioners have actually not developed a capacity to stay with difficulty and anguish, to truly tend to our own wounds and all the grief and all the protective behaviors that surround it, when we have not moved through the slow aspects of radical healing, and you haven't in the first 5 to 10 experiences, we might find ourselves uttering words of urgency. So a wounded healer has to learn to be patient, to be a-patient. The word patience, like the word patient, comes from the Latin root word pati, which means to bear suffering. So to be patient then, or to be a-patient, means to learn to bear suffering. And amidst suffering, to remain responsive and not become reactive. And I would personally add that patience is the capacity to also to attune to joy and remain equanimous amidst suffering. So when we're embodying patience, our clients can co-regulate with us as they turn towards the pain. And in our own calm presence, they can learn to transform themselves into the healers that they actually need. For through being patient and through learning to tend to their suffering, through giving meaning to it, this process of reappraisal, and through an authentic curiosity about the nature of their suffering, they can learn that it is safe to feel pain and to feel vulnerable. And this is, I think, the quintessential antidote to any narcissistic tendencies. So when we work with a patient that suffers from serious trauma, or narcissistic defenses for that matter, we must strive very diligently to not become allied with their parts that are motivated by the tremendous pain they hold or have been holding, motivated by their sense of urgency. We must be very careful not to ally with their narcissistic parts that might tell tales that are actually spiritual bypassing, tales of otherworldly glory, and of course it is a real pleasure to celebrate the empathic joy of seeing a client move through something very hard or really marvel at the beauty of life. But we must also really not forget that there is the dark. And we must become a beacon of calm in a sea of suffering, because the moment we react to their pain and their urgency with urgency, we will not heal, but we will merely alleviate. Reacting to pain with urgency will not heal, but it will merely alleviate. So the wounded healer that truly answers the sort of initiatory call to become a healer might be positioned very well to care for others. However, and this is what this talk is about, there's a massive shadow that comes with the archetype of the wounded healer. So let's turn our attention to the main topic of this talk, narcissism itself. And first, what I would like to do is offer a brief clinical definition of narcissism as it is commonly understood by psychotherapists and psychiatrists that rely on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, So that's the DSM-5. And in doing so, I will offer some important things that you can also keep in mind when you're working with a client that you suspect might have narcissism or very strong narcissistic parts or narcissistic dynamics. Now, according to the DSM-5, narcissism is a personality disorder. This means that many of the traits and the associated behavioral patterns, they're sometimes called a temperament, are structural in their nature. They're not something that suddenly appears and goes away again. So unless these issues are treated, they are actually fairly stable over time. Once personality comprises regular thought patterns, psycho-emotive somatic responses to both internal and environmental stimuli, especially stimuli that are social in nature, and the sort of dynamics of relational tendencies. In narcissism, we recognize, and this is a quote, a pervasive pattern of grandiosity in fantasy or behavior, a constant need for admiration, and a lack of empathy, end quote. And according to Paroma Mitra and others, whose article I'm citing, narcissistic personality disorder, also known as NPD, is, and I quote again, or can, and I quote again, cause significant social and occupational impairment and often has complications of comorbid psychiatric and substance use disorders, end quote. And in their article that is called Narcissistic Personality Disorder, it's very succinct, they describe a couple of common traits of those suffering from NPD, such as, and I will kind of paraphrase quote for a bit, low harm avoidance, whereas harm avoidance is a bias towards inhibiting behavior that would result in punishment or non-reward, folks with NPD instead may act in general disregard for the consequences of their actions. Or they might view the potential gain from risky behavior as far outweighing the gamble of any potential harm that may result. Novelty-seeking behavior describes an inherent desire to initiate novel activities likely to produce a reward signal. High reward dependence is also common amongst people with NPD to the point of demanding praise when completing sometimes simple tasks or when forming new relationships. Individuals with NPD try to be social, but usually for the sake of receiving praise or being seen in association with others of high status, which provides them with internal reward and validation. And finally, folks with NPD are quite persistent, with an extreme desire to seek out reward and be successful, end quote. So, low harm avoidance, high reward and novelty-seeking behaviors, and a persistent drive to attain success, validation, status, and recognition. Now, this can be, but is not necessarily coupled to more infamous traits, such as Machiavellianism, which is sort of like extremely strategic and manipulative behavior, sadism, the aforementioned lack of empathy, intense feelings of shame and guilt, feelings of disgust and envy, overwhelming experiences of internal lack and emptiness that are sometimes called existential fears of isolation, abandonment, and overwhelm, and then there's the apparent lack of remorse. What is important to understand is that most people actually do not qualify for this clinical definition of NPD. And it's also important to realize that those of us that have narcissistic traits or narcissistic defenses, and even those that are diagnosed with NPD, do not necessarily cause harm or want to cause harm. Some of them do, but I think it's very important to look at narcissism through a lens of compassion and to take serious that as a mental health problem, those with narcissistic tendencies suffer, and they suffer greatly. And due to their very personality structures, addressing that suffering, being with it, reflecting on it, and ultimately healing it is incredibly difficult and will require great courage, care, and self-compassion. Now, the core challenge with narcissism is that it is paradoxical in nature. Because whereas someone with narcissistic tendencies or MPD has a profound or extreme need for validation, is often engaging in behaviors that are likely to cause upset and negative responses for which folks with these traits are so incredibly sensitive. So it's very paradoxical behavior. Now, if we return to the aforementioned article, we also read about the causes of narcissism. And it starts with biological factors, including hereditary traits. So if one or both parents have narcissistic traits, it is more likely that a child has them too. So these play a role alongside, and I will quote again, psychoanalytic factors which contribute to the development of personality traits and disorders. However, and this is why I chose this quote, narcissistic qualities are not necessarily pathological, as narcissistic traits are a normal part of human development. Narcissism manifests around age 8, increases in adolescence, and decreases in adulthood. Still, individuals with a high degree of narcissism early in life tend to maintain a high degree of narcissism in later life. End quote. I bring attention to this is because there's a lot of environmental stimuli that seem to
Good, how are you?
deepen.
Nice to see you. I've got a friend.
Nice to meet you.
All right. That seem to trigger or exacerbate narcissism. What I hope you take away from this is that narcissism has certain qualities and traits. It comes in a range of forms and shapes, mostly subclinical, some clinical in nature. And as I said earlier, most of us have narcissistic parts. But in order to talk about parts, and I've been doing that throughout this presentation so far, I'd like to explore two important concepts, contextuality and multiplicity. I'm going to check for time as well. So multiplicity is the idea that we all consist of different parts. Multiplicity means that our subjective experience is not one that is singular, like having one self, one subjective experience, or only one voice or set of thoughts in our head, but that we are dividuals, which is to say we can be divided. We're not singular. Individual is indivisible. That's what it means. So we could call ourselves dividuals, although that would really require quite a significant shift in how we talk to each other. So there's no thing that we could cut out of the social fabric and point to and say that right there is an individual. There's nothing that could independently exist outside of the context of social, cultural, and economic structures. There's also no self that we could separate from the web of relationships it is embedded in. In fact, what I argue is that the self that we experience in here is precisely characterized by multiplicity or by plurality. And this is quite clear if you think about it, because the reason you can experience internal tension when you're faced with conflicting desires is because you have different parts or different aspects that want different things. And those parts are sometimes called subminds or subselves, and those have or represent different desires, fears, drives, hopes, and dreams that together make up the space that we call you or I. So you enact different conglomerate patterns woven of thought, emotion, and sensation that have formed and shaped over the course of your life, and that are activated by certain contexts and that respond in more or less quite predictable ways. Now, to some extent, the concept of a part is akin to the concept of psychic defenses. Some parts are managerial in nature and seek to maintain equilibrium in the internal system. And in classical terms, narcissistic parts avoid internal tensions and imbalances by projecting internal feelings onto others, by repressing internal feelings that are difficult, or by the flat-out denial of or rejection of reality. Other parts are protectors, and those ensure that difficult feelings, thoughts, and sensations are avoided at all cost. For example, through drug use, sex, or other high-risk behaviors, or through the manipulation of others around them. Now, narcissistic parts come in all sorts of sizes and shapes, but at their heart we find this incapacity to endure feelings of anguish, unlove, unworthiness, shame, guilt, vulnerability, and the reaction to those feelings that often takes the form of either I'm better than or I'm going to put you down. So parts and patterns are so ingrained and so sophisticated that they can almost appear as autonomous and independent selves with their own voices and volition. So multiplicity is the idea that we contain multitudes. The second thing is that we're not just containing multitudes, but the who and how we are changes as contexts change. So we are different in every relationship, in every moment in time. So we are contextual beings. And whereas multiplicity helps us explain why we experience internal conflict, contextuality can help us understand why we act, think, and feel so differently when we're around different people. And so why we are different with clients, friends, family, or a lover. Now, I think that one of the biggest pitfalls of individualism and neoliberalism is that they constitute singular selves. They turn human beings into individuals that are stable and that exist independent of their context. And it is because of those ideas that we can have the notion that mental health problems originate in the brain, in the individual, rather than through a complex interplay with the context. So somehow mental health problems come up in an organ that doesn't relate to the outside world. It's like saying that Chiron's experiences of racism and discrimination and early childhood abandonment are not what causes harm. From the neoliberal point of view, he primarily suffers because of that poison and what that poison did in his body. In other words, he suffered from an imbalance of neurotransmitters. Perhaps this is also what Michela D'Amico points to when they talk about a narcissistic culture. Because we live in a society that eschews any form of vulnerability, that actively places responsibility in an individual while denying their relationality and all of the social responsibilities and reciprocity that come with that. We live in a culture that avoids grief, that doesn't know how to be with guilt without it spilling over into shame, and that actively encourages people's sense of entitlement, self-enrichment, and economic gain at the expense of others. And thus it rewards those without a conscience and those who do not feel, or at the very least who do not act upon their feelings of empathy. And I think this is extremely clear and visible if we look at the conflict in Gaza right now. In fact, I think one of the core insults that is flung at people who are concerned with the suffering of others is that they are too sensitive. We call them snowflakes. So narcissism is quite rampant in mainstream culture. We are obsessed with how we look, what other people think of us, how we come across, if we're liked, if we can accumulate followers. But in psychedelic culture, we find an additional set of discourses, narratives, and practices that equally reflect an incapacity to be patient, and that very often enable forms of narcissistic abuse and play into potentially narcissistic parts on the side of the practitioner. So I would like to go over some of these narratives and practices that I have basically come to consider quite serious red flags. And the first of that is what I call the discourse of specialness. And with everything that I'm about to say, I want you to keep in mind this sense of normalizing and then encourage you to really think, does this apply to me? And if it does, see what happens if you're just with that. So the discourses of specialness. Now, keeping in mind that at the heart of narcissism, we find an incapacity to be vulnerable, to be human, to be flawed or imperfect, because the narcissistic defense or reaction is to render any experience of being different or lesser than into one of being special and better than. So one way of identifying a narcissistic part in ourselves, in our clients, or in other practitioners is if they think, feel, express, pretend, or act as if they are special, as if something about them is above or beyond the human, deeper than others, more magical. They have more spiritual insight, or they're more powerful. And some examples could be practitioners that claim to have been recognized. Very often there are stories, there's a special origin story. Either they were recognized at a young age, or they had a special gift, or special things happened to them when they were younger. They were initiated into the mystery, or into an important lineage, or into multiple tradition, or they possess magical powers, or they received and often exaggerate endorsements from established and other very special people. And very often, other people in their vicinity, both clients and students, might speak about them to confirm this specialness and don't give them any constructive feedback anymore. So their compassion, their prowess, their lack of flaws are actually shared by people in their community. And those people also share their own firsthand experiences of how healing, powerful, or special the practitioner or their method is. Moreover, what is often lacking in these stories, so what is not said, is what didn't work. Where someone is just messy, where someone's shadow might be showing up. There's no sense of basic criticism. There are no stories about when the practitioner got it wrong, or where the practitioner made mistakes, and how they actually showed up in the face of that. The practitioner, in other words, is infallible, and not only invites and encourages the projections of specialness, they actively identify with overly positive transferences, and they avoid correcting them. And then they also reject negative transferences. So if someone is calling you an angel, oh yeah, maybe I am an angel and a being of light in this ayahuasca ceremony. But when someone calls you Lucifer, and I worked with a client that called me Lucifer one day, I might have suddenly the urge to kind of reject, oh, how dare he say that I'm Lucifer, as if I'm tempting others, and so I get upset and might have explicit and implicit ways of rejecting that particular transference if it's negative. So due to their perceived power, a lot of very quote-unquote special practitioners have people around them that reproduce their specialness because it lends them power and status through association. So the narratives of specialness are what enable and often underlie abusive behaviors, such as sleeping with the practitioner. Why? Because it accelerates healing, or people believe that you can sexually heal because they have this special power. Or I might fully subjugate myself to a practitioner. Why? Because their specialness will ensure protection. It will prevent any harm from occurring. They're to be trusted. So what I'm trying to point to is that there are specific narratives that surround abuse and that often excuse it. That it was not the practitioner, or if you're working with a narcissistic client, the client's ego or their basic human desire, because they are above such normal things. They are not subject to making human mistakes and are exempt, therefore, from the ethical rules that apply to everyone else. This is that entitlement. So even if some of those narratives within the appropriate cultural settings could actually support healing and growth, and I'm not speaking in any absolute terms here, I am naturally extremely skeptical of these narratives of specialness because of how, in the vast majority of cases, narratives of specialness function or double as apologetics for harmful behaviors. They are self-aggrandizing, and they help place practitioners above certain ethical commitments due to their supposed specialness. And the culture of psychedelics has its own rhetoric of specialness. We are allowed to touch our client or do X, Y, or Z, which is not allowed in regular therapy because of how special this is. So to really look at this is an incredibly important part in insulating the field of psychedelic care from potentially harmful practices. This notion of specialness also leads to another common characteristic that I often see, namely that there's practitioners that lead with very narcissistic parts, and they seem to know, or at least they think they know, better than their clients what is going on, what is good for their clients, what their clients need, and what is happening for their clients. Basically, they think they're mind readers. Now, practitioners with strong narcissistic tendencies believe that they know better than the client what is good for their client because they have a grandiose image of themselves. And not only is this fundamentally disempowering to a client, and as such at odds with the purported aspirations of the healing relationship, it might additionally play into an unmet need of many clients who struggle with especially early developmental trauma, namely the desire that other people take care of us. That and an additional desire, which we often see with people that suffered from early childhood abuse, that they can finally restore trust with a practitioner after that trust has been violated at a very young age. Now, everyone to a certain degree has moments where we, of course, long for some sort of regression to a childlike state where we are safe and secure and free from worry, where our caregiver solved complex problems for us so we don't have to do anything. Of course, some of us have never had such a caregiver experience, and so we long for it all the more. Or some of us might feel overwhelmed by responsibilities and the demands of contemporary life, which is just fucking hard and complex. So it's easy if someone else is telling us what to do. It can even feel like an alleviation of burdens. Moreover, existentially speaking, the experience of freedom can actually be difficult for people, because freedom comes with responsibility. If I'm free to make my own choices, that also means I'm responsible for the outcomes. And so some people, especially when overwhelmed or struggling with trauma, prefer the practitioner to tell them what to do. And if a practitioner then has a narcissistic part that thinks I know what to do, we have a potentially very toxic mix that is disempowering to the client and inflating the ego of the practitioner all the more. This is why, especially in these times of complexity, when we see this pulling towards authoritarian leaders and omniscient practitioners, that we need to be very careful. So another part of the narratives and practices is what I perhaps find one of the most dangerous dynamics in the space at this moment. And this is the idea that whenever a client expresses concern, fear, anxiety, doubt, or any form of opposition, or when they question or self-assert or set healthy boundaries, that there are practitioners that reinterpret those as forms of resistance. Usually as resistance to the medicine or the process, but sometimes more resistance to the method or the practitioner themselves. And in that sense, I think that one of the biggest challenges right now is the proliferation of narratives that the ego is a problem, that psychological defenses and resistances need to be broken down, that what will be ultimately healing for a client is the destruction, death, surrender, or overwhelming of the very psychic structures that, from a trauma-informed perspective, have formed and shaped over many, many years of life in response to profoundly unsafe circumstances. So breaking down the ego or giving very high doses of psychedelics to break through someone's defenses and help them let go, very often upon closer examination reveals an ideology, a fundamental belief that protective behaviors are somehow bad. Now, in forming an approach in which the protectors of the psyche are blasted away in favor of some sort of divine truth flowing in, disregards the very significant harm and re-traumatization that can occur when we actually lay bare the most vulnerable and intimate parts of ourselves without adequately tending to safety, care, and trust. As practitioners, it is vitally important that we understand that we cannot demand that someone feels safe with us and trusts us. We can only earn it by turning up consistently, by showing up consistently. And this is precisely where narcissism and harmful practices can meet. It is these practices that will enable abusive practitioners to reinterpret their clients' experiences as you're not trusting enough, and who will constitute any form of opposition or questioning of them as an act of resistance from the ego, and as such, as something that needs to be disregarded and subdued. And ironically, it is precisely because practitioners themselves are vulnerable and cannot maturely respond to challenges to their authority, their role, their behavior or practices. Ironically, it is those practitioners themselves who become annoyed with clients that seem to be stuck because it activates their sense of impotence. And I've worked with quite a lot of practitioners that tell me that they want to offer very high doses to their clients out of a fear that their clients will not have a specific type of experience and will project that onto them. So they're afraid that their clients will associate the lack of experience with them as a practitioner. It's a sort of meta projection. And ironically, again, it is precisely in such instances that the fragility of the practitioner's ego, so their own unintegrated wounded healer and narcissistic parts, that cause them to eventually end up harming clients by giving them too much, too soon, and by insisting that they stop resisting. So ultimately, and again, ironically, the narcissistic grandiose fantasies of omnipotence come crashing down when practitioners realize that they can actually not hold the responsibility for their clients' lives, that they do not actually have the answers and do not really know how their clients ought to solve a problem simply because they are not in their shoes. So we can stand next to our client, but we cannot do it for them. And this moment of realization when things come crashing down often results in the moment that we call gaslighting, reality abuse. So we're gaslighting the client now. This is a game of denial and projection. It's basically suggesting that the client's implosion or collapse or their lack of a good experience is not because we as practitioners were continuously overextending and directive. It's their own fault for not trusting enough, not working hard enough, not surrendering enough, doing the method wrong, or not listening, or even further with bigger implications, not subjugating to the practitioner. So ultimately, specialness and breaking through often lead to breakdowns and harm at worst, and disempowered clients at best. I'm going to take a short break to just look at your cameras. Shall I keep going? Do you want me to keep going? Do you want a mini break? I see a couple thumbs up. Good. In that case, yeah, someone comes online, turns the camera on, gives us a thumbs up, and then, okay, good. I'll keep going. Now, it is equally important to realize that when we're working with a client who displays narcissistic tendencies, that blasting through their defenses and removing their protectors aggressively, especially if they've been taunting us as a practitioner and kind of like got on our nerves or pissed us off, might actually bring those clients in contact with the big sad, the dark void, or overwhelming feelings of shame and abandonment, of being unworthy and unloved, of not belonging. So it might confront the client with the harm that they caused others, without the capacity to repress the difficult feelings of guilt that they normally can rely on. As such, a very big and very real risk for people with strong narcissistic defenses, and especially with full MPD, is suicide. So when the suffering becomes too great and overwhelming, suicidality and self-harm behaviors can flare up significantly in those who have strong narcissistic parts. Now the question is, with all of this being said, what can we do? First of all, I think we need to return to the wounded healer and the healing impulse. Kailea Taylor, I named her earlier, the author of the book, The Ethics of Caring, which I strongly recommend you get if you want to start doing some shadow work. She coined the term healing impulse and writes, and I quote, "One concept that I have found to be both true and comforting comforting is that every ethical misstep I've taken myself or have seen others take has proven to have had a healing impulse at its root. My ethical missteps have stemmed from an impulse to either heal the client or myself. One common impulse to heal oneself as a professional is to use a client relationship to some extent as a stand-in for the social relationship one actually needs, but doesn't have or doesn't have time for. End quote. So the healing impulse pertains to someone's desire to engage in a healing process. However, when we remember the notion of multiplicity, we might see that we can approach healing from two perspectives. Either from the perspective of wisdom and compassion, healing as a move towards wholeness, where we integrate all of our parts and important aspects of ourselves that slowly become harmonized and aligned with our values and ethics, or through the eyes of a part. And a part wants something or desperately needs something, but cannot see that whole picture. So from the perspective of a part or the perspective of lack, healing often takes on very contorted and disconnected images of wholeness. So when we lead with or when we're blended with parts with a very limited perspective on the world, parts that do not recognize that they are not all there is to being, we can actually only see the limitations of those parts reflected out there. To make this concrete, a frightened part sees a scary world. A paranoid part distrusts others. A horny part could see certain relationships solely in terms of either sexual gratification or aversion. So healing from the perspective of compassion and wisdom might be akin to seeking to make whole. However, from the perspective of a part, healing is an act of temporarily releasing tension and pain. It is about experientially avoiding what it thinks is causing the suffering, and usually it's not really right about that. And it's trying to create conditions, for example, the accumulation of power, that it thinks will insulate it from suffering. In other words, healing from the perspective of a part is following the script, the pattern, or the behavior that it has learned or that it expects will relieve it from the anguish of existing in an impermanent world. So how does the wounded healer experience the healing impulse? I think it's clear, I think many of you will have had your own psychedelic experiences, that in the early stages of healing, we are often filled with gratitude. There's a sense of purpose that emerges. This is the process of reappraisal that I mentioned in the beginning of the talk. Now, often we experience also a massive surge of energy that is being released into the system, especially when parts that have been isolated or burdened or disconnected for so long become unburdened and finally reconnect. We're filled with joy. We might connect to pleasure. We might feel continuous elation. Sometimes for the first time in actual decades, we might feel pleasure in our body. And deep suffering might actually form the initial impulse to seek out healing. So there's this innate self-compassionate drive to be free from pain and anguish. And the moment we start to feel healing, a form of gratitude might arise that translates itself into the desire to heal others, to heal others. And it is precisely in that beautiful desire, that healing impulse, that we might develop or lead with parts that would love to focus on others, so that they don't actually have to stay with those pesky parts that we just recovered and brought back into the system. So this notion that I'm going to heal others before I've done my own wounded healing work, wounded healer work, is often premature. So we might want to skip the hard and slow work of integration, the work of embodying, clearing, stabilizing, slowing down, and eventually honing our skills, knowledge, wisdom, and attention. So during psychedelic experiences, there's also something else that can happen, and this is more speculative. There's very little research on this, but narcissistic parts, of course, can also rear their heads. For example, in an experience of awe and love, certain parts might experience those feelings as conditional and dependent on their looks, performance, purity, spiritual attainment, or some other condition. So it's not unconditional love. In experiences of what is sometimes simplistically called oneness, a narcissistic part might identify with the absolute and comes back convinced that they are God. And of course, the secret is that we are God, but not like that. Another potential complication is that a narcissistic part and their psychic defenses, like projection and repression, actually become amplified during a psychedelic experience. Or a client with a narcissistic part starts to act out, to disrupt the group, pick fights, or regresses to a childlike state in a very performative manner. Or the very real needs that someone experiences during the psychedelic peak feels so vulnerable that asking for help feels like an admission of defeat. And so the ways in which a client asks for support to you as a practitioner might feel contrived or performative or theatrical or highly transactional or even manipulative. And lastly, narcissistic parts can be so assertive that they actually block the effect of the substance or medicine and appear to be utterly unaffected. I recently went to a conference where I spoke to a neuroscientist, and what she is researching is the hypothesis that psychedelics could actually reify one's sense of self and amplify one's capacity to repress and deny, potentially leading people with narcissistic parts to witness a decrease in their capacity to be vulnerable by increasing their capacity to push difficult feelings out of consciousness. It's almost like throwing a consciousness into a psychedelic experience is actually like a training school for the ego rather than one that deconstructs the ego. So important in all of these cases is to keep in mind that narcissistic parts appear to be invulnerable and great, or can come across as arrogant, manipulative, annoying, and aggressive, but hide and conceal a profound sense of lack and shortcoming. So if we're truly in the healing business, we need to start thinking about how we can show up compassionately and yet very boundaried in response to a narcissistic part. You might also wonder what you could do as a practitioner to ensure that you are engaging your own shadow self. And we're coming to the end of the presentation here. I know we're a bit over time already. My first recommendation to all of you that haven't done this before is to go into therapy. If you want to work with groups, do group therapy. Therapy is a very safe way to kind of get in touch with difficult feelings, but also with the support of someone that understands your sensitivities and that cares about you unconditionally. And of course, preferably we find a therapist that understands and respects your particularities, especially if you're queer like me, or a person of color, or have a global majority background, or are neurodivergent like me, or you have a special need. But if you think that you do not therapy and you've never been in therapy and you do have a desire to offer psychedelic services to others, then I'm immediately suspect of a potential narcissistic part. And of course, there's no absolutes. I'm not averse to the idea that some folks genuinely do not need therapy, or we could also postulate that therapy itself is a disciplining Foucauldian force that shapes subjectivity and manufactures consent within a capitalist neoliberal system. And I would agree with a lot of that criticism. So let me be clear by saying that when I talk about therapy, what I mean is that as a practitioner, we engage the process of becoming very open, vulnerable, transparent to an elder or a senior practitioner, to be witnessed in our vulnerability and to be supported in the process of becoming more friendly and compassionate with yourself. And I think this is especially important for people who wish to offer services that might fall under the banner of healing. And additionally, if you want to offer healing to people, then please train as a therapist as well. And perhaps this is less important for people who are engaging psychedelics as a religious or spiritual practice and want to guide others in that capacity. But for them, I would encourage reading the book Toward a Psychology of Awakening by John Welwood, who coined the term spiritual bypassing. And echoing a Buddhist teacher that I worked with, for the spiritual practitioners amongst you, it is better to ask yourself how you are spiritually bypassing rather than if you are spiritually bypassing, because we tend to see much more when we ask the right question. This is also why it's so important and so powerful to work with this sense of urgency. So every time this sense of urgency comes up, and therefore you want to do something, it can be fruitful to just pause, to take a moment to slow down. Especially if you notice that you have an agenda for your client, that you think you know what they need, that's a good moment to start reflecting. An urgency mindset is very often actually rooted in our own resolved trauma, or in those parts of us that hold a feeling of inadequacy, the imposter syndrome, fears of incompetence or impotence, or in that desperate desire to do something to transform that gnawing sense of existential dread. Urgency is rooted in our sense that something is wrong. And I think we must prevent projecting that sense that something is wrong onto our clients, thinking that something is wrong with them. And I think this is one of the few places where I'm not sure if it's an encouragement or I'm a little rigid, but I genuinely think that if you have consistent access to feeling that fundamentally you're a good person in all of your imperfections, that you should wait guiding others, because it's extremely difficult to show up like a genuine healer and see the good in others if you cannot see it in yourself. So concretely, to work with yourself, you could ask 3 questions, and they're fairly basic at the surface level, but they're deepening. The first is, why do you want to become a psychedelic practitioner? And at the heart of this are 2 things. One, keep asking. Don't settle for the first, second, or third answer. 2, keep accepting. You might find out you're in it for money, power, sex, status. And if your knee-jerk reaction is to shut that down and to say, I'm not allowed to want that, then you're missing the point of this exercise. It is to actually start to acknowledge that all of those things are inside of us. So the perversities, the intrusive thoughts, the socially sanctioned things, only when we bring them into our consciousness and understand through the lens of multiplicity that we can hold both profound, altruistic, empathetic, compassionate motivations and purely selfish ones, that we're not either of those. Both can exist at the same time, and only through looking at them can we come to ask ourselves, could this potentially be harmful? And if so, now we have something that we can do to mitigate that harm. Now, an important part of asking this question is to ask it in community. And one way that you can do that is by asking other people around you that know you well, what do you think I might not be seeing about myself? The second question is I just said it, it's asking yourself, how might I already be harming clients? How might I harm clients in the future? So instead of assuming that we're not going to harm clients and ask, okay, how can I prevent it? It's almost assuming I will harm them. Again, asking the question in a different way helps us to become a bit sharper. And here too, I think it's fruitful to share your findings with those around you. And then the third one is a bit more subtle. It's a bit more specific to what we're doing during ceremony or session or guiding, or even if we call it guiding or not. And it is to ask yourself, how directive am I when I'm in that space? Do I impose my own worldview, my ideas, my practices upon the client? Do I show up with an agenda? Do I change the music in the hope that I will bring out a little bit more of that sadness or not? And again, this is not about saying what is right or wrong. It is about consistently reflecting upon who we are as a practitioner, What is driving us? And to make sure that we have a very good eye on those parts of us that are driven by unmet needs, that feel vulnerable, that hold desires and longings. The moment we can stay with them and really bear the suffering of their presence, it's hard sometimes to have a sexual need that is not fulfilled. But the more we are capable of holding that internally and not bringing that to a client, the more safe we become as a presence to others in that process of healing. The most important in all of this, I think, is that you do not isolate yourself from other practitioners, but rather that you turn towards community, that you seek out elders and supervisors, that you seek to become and remain transparent, and that you work in community with others. And then together with those others, that you seek to cultivate a culture of vulnerability where we can just say, hey, I think I have a crush on one of my clients. What the fuck do I do? Like, how do you deal with this? Like, how am I? But that there's a culture that then does not immediately expel you, but takes it serious, shares their wisdom, shares their knowledge, and help you stay in right relationship and not transgress and not harm that client. Additionally, it's very important to keep paying attention to those parts of you that think that the ethics don't apply to you because of some sort of specialness. And I think all of us have had this at some point, in a small way or a big way. At least I'm sure I've had that moment, and it's very important to keep very clear and just bring it up with a supervisor or a trusted peer. And whenever we remain in community and a community that of peers and supervisors, every time that we might suffer from the imposter syndrome, kind of we are one downing ourselves, or every time we're kind of like inflating ourselves, boosting our ego, or one upping, your friends and your colleagues will bring you back to your rightful place. And that is shoulder to shoulder with every other fallible human being. So I want to wrap up with the myth of Chiron. The last time I told that story was in a training program, and I had forgotten about a very important aspect of it. Normally, I would stop. Chiron is struck by the poisoned arrow, and he becomes the wounded healer. But in reality, something else happened. After many years, Chiron acknowledges and accepts his condition, and he strikes a deal with Zeus. He trades his immortality with Prometheus, who you might know as the person that stole fire from the gods and gave it to the humans. So Prometheus becomes immortal, and Chiron attains mortality. And this allows him to finally succumb to his wound and to actually die. And then, as a token of appreciation, Zeus places him in the stars where he forms the constellation Sagittarius. And in that sense, the final piece of Chiron's myth is so powerful because only the full acceptance of mortality allows us to actually end suffering. And of course, I'm not arguing in favor of suicide here, but I choose to understand the ending of this story as an embrace of the fact that we are all fatally wounded. We are poisoned and marked with impermanence. From the moment we enter the world, our only true destination is the process of dying. So to be more explicit about what I'm trying to say, I think we can discern between pain, which, like aging, is inevitable, and suffering, this existential anguish, a life lived without purpose, where we're isolated or disconnected, or where we're fighting impermanence and trying to change things outside of our control. That suffering is optional. The greatest narcissistic fantasy that we often find in those attracted to psychedelics and spiritual practice is the very promise of liberation. However, liberation through the eyes of a narcissistic parts look like invulnerability, like impermanence will no longer hold sway over us. Enlightenment and the identity of being a special practitioner kind of both shield the narcissistic part, or thinks it does, from anguish and suffering. Whereas the myth of Narcissus someone will not have the answer to this. It describes a young man who falls in love with his own reflection and reflects on the outside and what he thinks others might see in him. Chiron reflected on his internal life, and he realized that the only way we can make peace with our pain and cease to suffer is to accept that we will die, to accept our mortality. So the myth of Chiron is really a great source of inspiration for me, because it acknowledges our humanity, our care, our empathy, and our continuous commitment to understanding the path of healing and care. Chiron can really wake us up to the ways in which wounding and healing are intrinsically connected. And as Sagittarius looks down on us benevolently, I feel very encouraged to embrace my mortality and to see the very impermanence as a gift that endlessly reminds me to savor this very moment. I'm poisoned, wounded, and yet joyous and open to respond to what is needed right now. Thank you for listening. I need a breath. I notice I get a bit of a dry throat. I also notice we have 4 minutes left on formal time. If anyone needs to leave, please do. But I'm happy to go on for a little while longer if you have any questions. I'm just gonna pour myself a glass of water. So if you have any questions, you can either raise your hand or put something in the chat, and then I will be back in less than a minute. You're going to see me walk in and out. And I'm happy to answer some questions then. All right. Sandra, thank you for helping. Are there any questions? I could also open the chat up first, but if anyone wants to ask a question, feel free to unmute.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. I learned a lot. It was really great. Thank you. And now I have a question about how to find the right words when we recognize this kind of behavior in our community with co-facilitators or even with supervisors, like how to find the right words from the heart without being judgmental or to be heard.
There's a lot of different things how we can approach that. Again, I don't want to put Sandra on the spot, but Sandra and I have been having a lot of conversations about how to do this well. And this is very much work in progress. I don't think anyone has a definitive answer to this. One of the first places where I usually start, let's say you and I would be working individually and you come to me and you say, like, I have this problem in my community. The first question I would ask you is, are you safe? Right? And maybe for whatever reason you don't feel safe. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're not safe, but I will take very serious that you don't feel safe. And usually the moment we feel something feels off, I don't feel safe, that's a good enough reason to start asking some questions. And for me, when I notice that I'm in a relationship with a colleague and I start to walk on eggshells, or I feel uncomfortable maybe offering feedback, or I have this weird thing that there's these transactions taking place or there's games being played, the first thing I do is I kind of take a step back, right? I want to make sure that I don't become reactive. And I go to a trusted supervisor or colleague. That's the first thing that I do. And by trusted, I also want to make sure that they don't know this other person. So they don't have a sort of reason to kind of like commiserate with me. And in fact, when I start to kind of like vent, they just flag, Daan, I hear you're venting right now. What do you need? Because sometimes I just notice, you know what, I was just tired and pissed off, and it was the midst of a long retreat. I just, I didn't like that they farted in that moment. And I came up with a whole story about how inconsiderate they are, but it's just a human thing. They just, and I use farts a little as a metaphor, but um, but sometimes my supervisor might ask, yeah, that I can imagine that you know that doesn't feel right, and then starts to ask questions. And so the two questions that then come up for me are questions that pertain to me. Why do I find this particular thing annoying? Oh, my dad always farted, right? And made a joke of it or whatever. I have an association. So actually, then I've discovered it's not so much about this other person. This is my own stuff. But it might also be that I realize, like, yeah, I might have a bit of a sensitivity, but there's something that is something else that feels off. And then we might become curious about what is happening there. And the perspective from an outsider can be very fruitful. They can help you kind of like stabilize. And then what I often listen for are particular red flags. So do I hear a lot of commiseration? Do I hear a lot of shit talking about one particular person? Do I hear potential, toxic group dynamics? And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a narcissistic practitioner or that it's a toxic culture. It could point to systemic issues. For example, if you work for an organization and that continuously makes you work retreats, but you're under-resourced, underpaid, and overworked, yeah, in a group of people that are stressed out and burned out, you're going to see conflict. But usually it's not really real conflict, right? It's systemic problems playing out on a personal or interpersonal level. So you might start to ask these questions, and then when we kind of hone in, we might realize, wait, but this particular thing that this person said, and usually it's like denying your experience or an absolute lack of curiosity, a lack of empathy, some of the characteristics that we just talked about might point to a narcissistic part that they are leading with. And then again, I would take a step back and ask myself, so if this is happening, what might be happening for this person? Are they feeling actually under attack, under threat, even when they're not? Again, there's a difference between not feeling safe and actually not being safe. And so in that sense, it also makes sense to do objective, like just some reality testing. Like, am I actually unsafe right now? What would be the risk? Now, the last thing that you said was, or maybe not last, something about what if your supervisor, right? Another question could be, what if my spiritual teacher? What if my taita? What if the church leader? That's usually a good reason to reach out to a practitioner that is outside of your community, that understands cults and narcissism and grandiosity, and that just helps you, go over a little bit of I don't want to call it a checklist, but some basic pointers to understand if you are perhaps in a bad place. And it happens to the best, right? If you look at the Osho documentary, Wild Wild Country, there are people with PhDs and university degrees that just end up doing stuff that they would have never done if they had not been under very particular social circumstances. And especially with psychedelics, we dissolve boundaries, our amplifications and projections are amplified, our transferences and projections are amplified, and so we might no longer see clearly. And then when there's that discourse, like, oh, you are the problem, you need to keep working on yourself, your ego is getting in the way. If that's a discourse that permeates a community, that is an additional sort of like red flag. It's not in and of itself a reason to believe that, you're in a cult or this is narcissism, but it would prompt me to be very, very careful about what's happening here? Is this a discourse that is actually serving people, or is it actually gaslighting people and abusing them, and then functions or doubles as a sort of like apologetic for very, very bad behaviors? And I've seen that quite often. If you look at some of Jules Evans's writings, there are some big ones out there at the moment. A couple of just blatant cults led by narcissistic individuals. Was that enough? Is that a good start? Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Trust in your own feeling. If something feels off, that's a great start to take that serious. And either it reveals something about you or about someone else or about both. But trust and listen to that feeling, and look for people you trust. Yeah. Anyone else?
There's a question in chat.
Thank you, Sandra. Oh yeah, and thank you for the psychedelic safety flags. That's an excellent document. That's really it's like that is that sort of checklist. It's like no, I think I'm doing good. Someone says, in my opinion, perfectionists feel guilt, narcissists don't. I will respond to that very briefly. I think narcissists avoid feeling guilt, but they actually do feel. In order to avoid something, you need to actually have a capacity to feel it. And this is maybe one of the quintessential differences, even though there's so much overlap and there's a lot of discussion about differential diagnosis between sociopathy or psychopathy, psychopathy, one of those, or antisocial personality disorder, and narcissism. There's people that genuinely lack an internal somatic response to another, emotional response, empathy. And there's people that suffer from MPD or have narcissistic traits, and they're actually centered around not having to feel guilt because the guilt feels so crippling because of early childhood experiences in which they were made wrong, basically, at a sort of fundamental core level. And so I would disagree in saying that a narcissist doesn't feel guilt. They might not express remorse, they might not lead with guilt, but this is why the moment narcissists start to heal, one of the core emotions to become comfortable with is feelings of guilt and shame.
Right. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
It's because that was my comment, and and yeah, you clarifying that makes so much more sense. The question I got out of that is, how would I know the difference? Okay, way I interpreted the question is that how would I know that I'm not a perfectionist or more of a narcissist? Like your talk was probably the best talk I've had, and I've been diving deep in this for like a whole month. This is amazing, of all the thoughts of how it could be within us as well as what we could look for in a patient. But the idea of, am I just being a perfectionist, or am I like being and I don't think a narcissist would reflect on that, because I would not feel guilty for, if I was more of narcissistic, I would, choice or no choice, I don't think I'd feel guilty about doing something incorrectly. I would try really hard to cover it up and move on. But that's where I know that I can see where I want recognition, no doubt. I want to be recognized for making big changes in my community. Do I want to cut corners and do things wrong to get there? No. So the assessing myself, or doing that kind of checklist is what's going through my head. So when I answered that question, that's exactly what I was thinking, is that would I feel guilty if I did something wrong? And because I do think I'm a perfectionist a lot. So there's that's where I was getting at. But I appreciate that you were mentioning that. It's more of a a subconscious choosing of not feeling guilt because it's so painful. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, can I ask your name, because I see a couple of letters and
Yeah, I've got a couple accounts out here. This one I thought was going to be the one that I would say that. My name is Shayla.
Shayla.
I'm a Vancouver Island in Canada. I'm a pharmacist. I just I just got on medical leave because I own a business with no staff. So I've been working, burnt right to burnout. Ironically, happiest I've ever been in my life. So as far as that's concerned, is great. I'm most grateful of my life forever. But my body and brain have gone to mush, blackouts and everything else.
Yeah.
So I'm done. However, this is very exciting, and this is giving me my charge to do everything else in my life in that. So this is very exciting on that part. Hoping to do a nonprofit on Vancouver Island if we can, with doctor, nurse, and so. This is very, very informative. A lot of checklists for me. Go slow.
Thank you, Shayla. And yeah, that goes slow. In response to some of the things that you shared, I think I really appreciate this sense of depathologizing, right? So that we're kind of normalizing so many aspects of human experience, like perfectionism, and we start to take a step back and kind of just look at how many of these responses, these behavioral patterns, are a response or a reaction to adverse life events, right? We're trying to feel pleasure and avoid pain in its bare bone basics. And so when I say we can normalize, we can kind of like strip all this. Narcissism it's an insult at this point, right? And so it's interesting because if you look at the anti-psychiatry movement, or a lot of people that were diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, there's a very strong sense of, I don't want that. That label is pathologizing. It's a terrible way of doing this. But then when you take some time, you might hear the very same people that say that actually throw around the term, you're a narcissist, which it's a mental health problem. Yeah. So the challenge with narcissism is that many narcissists are fucking assholes, right? So it's like they get under our skin. Yeah. And we're talking pure MPD here. And it can be a real challenge, as you hear, also for me, to just structurally remember that the behaviors that people show us, our colleagues, our supervisors, we ourselves to ourselves in our internal talk, our clients, the behaviors that we show are usually rooted in a form of self-compassion, which is a desire to not feel difficult things, not feel pain. And very often they're not infused with wisdom. So yeah, if I'm in pain and I smoke cannabis or I take cocaine because I feel insecure, it appears as if it's self-compassion because I take the thing away. It's just not infused with wisdom because it's not going to actually solve the problem. Usually it even makes it worse over time. So I find it much more fruitful to ask, what is the suffering here for someone, whether that's you or a client? What are the traits that I see that either rub me in the wrong way or that the client is struggling with? Perfectionism, or they're always demanding of other people around them and they find it hard to actually maintain relationships. How much insight can we bring to that, right? Is there a sense of ignorance? Like ignorance is like to ignore that's what we're doing, or is there an openness and a curiosity? How much can I hold as a practitioner in terms of non-judgmental atmosphere? And then for me, it makes more sense to look at my own behavior in, am I harmful either to myself or to others? And to take that as a lens, rather than, is there something wrong with me? Is this perfectionism or is this narcissism? That question to me is less interesting. It's more interesting for me to understand how I'm doing and how my behavior, unconscious and conscious, might be impacting someone else. That's the more interesting part in these kind of things. So when I listen to you, I have a lot of curiosity, like, when does your perfectionism show up? Why does it show up? If you don't get it right, what would happen? What happens internally? What emotions come up? What does it remind you of? When did that first happen? Like, you can start to pull these little,
Yeah.
and in the beginning when you do that work, it's like the this is disgusting, but when you have the shower and you didn't clean and you have long hair, at one point you see this one hair sticking out and you pull it, and then the whole clog of disgust comes up. That's how that beginning process often feels to me. It's like we ask one question, we start to see the whole thing. And if you're asking these questions, beautiful. And then to your point, people with full-blown narcissistic personality disorder that would be diagnosed as such usually have a very don't want that, right? Are resistant or don't even acknowledge it. There's nothing wrong with me. It's the other people around me. I'm quite perfect, actually.
We probably won't see them because they won't be coming for therapy anyway.
Exactly, and it may take many years before they move to therapy. But when they do, it's usually motivated again by a deep sense of suffering. So, thank you, Daan. Please go ahead, because I know last time I think we didn't get around to your hand. So.
Thank you. It's just on the point that you're talking about and what Shayla brought up. Just a short anecdote about when I realized decades ago that my father was actually a narcissist. And the scenario was my daughter was 2 years old and he was pulling her on a cushion in the kitchen. And she lost her balance and she tumbled. And she was fine, but her head came close to the corner of the wall. But there was no problem at all. And my father said, Jesus Christ, Talon, we've got to stop this game before you hurt yourself and I end up being the bad guy. And that just said so much. And I think it really speaks to this about there can be, he's tremendously afraid of doing harm, but he can't hold on to those feelings. And if he thinks he might have had a negative impact on somebody, his only defense is to project it out and make the other wrong. So I don't know if that's helpful at all, but that's just what was coming up for me as you were talking.
Thank you, Daan. I also saw I think that was your other comment, like the support of the ego protections and getting rid of the agenda of complete ego death. There's actually this thing that I've observed a couple of times, specifically with folks that have somewhat stronger narcissistic tendencies or defenses or parts, if you will, is that same longing for, right, a spiritual experience or some form of deep liberation, spiritual liberation, might actually prompt them to seek out very high doses. And this is pure speculation. I might change my position on this, or maybe one of you tells me otherwise. But I have this hunch that if we take a very high dose and we are to a certain extent capable of some form of surrender or another, or the medicine just kind of like, pushes straight through, we might actually have a genuine, beautiful opening. What I often notice working with clients is that the initial challenges in the run-up and then actually in the come down. So when the ego is kind of like rebuilding, when we're putting things back together, is where I sometimes see a flare up in participants that have more narcissistic traits. And so during the peak, right, with this sort of like high dose, there's these managerial parts that are always in control. Like they have a profound desire to, can I just please let go? It's so much work. And then, especially with ayahuasca or MDMA, it's like, oh, the peak is I'm filled with love. And then the ego kind of sets back in. And suddenly the experience becomes part of a spiritual identity, or it's still in that sort of like come down, it becomes much more difficult to stay with the actual vulnerabilities. So thank you for that comment. I'm not sure if there's a... Yeah, and may I share this recording with my colleagues, and how can I get the references you mentioned? The references, I'm going to think about that. I'm a terrible academic or scholar in the sense that very often I read something and it's in one of my trizillion tabs that's open on my computer. So I'm going to do my best to get all the references to you. I'm not sure about sharing the recording. I'd have to check. Sandra?
Yeah, I think the leadership team would be open to that. So, and I think since there's a lot of value out of this particular conversation, I think we should talk about it, but traditionally not. But I think it might be valuable to share with the large community.
Good. That's a very complex question. So I just want to clarify for my own understanding, are you specifically thinking about these topics in the context of working with a client with potentially narcissistic defenses, or is this more of a general question? Yeah, so to just make sure when I talk about narcissistic parts, and maybe that's also coming back to this question around perfectionism, for me, it's a dual movement, right? It's an internal experience of lack, but it's also an external movement of inflation, if that makes sense. It's a sort of hiding and concealing. And maybe at the base level, that could be like masking, if that's a term you're familiar with, like pretending that everything is okay, or showing this sort of paradoxical behavior, right? I feel very sad, but I'm very cheerful. Yeah, so one of the first things is that I think as practitioners, and we need to become comfortable with the fact that we actually often don't know, and we will likely get it wrong, and that we're just staying present and available for hearing the moments when we got it wrong. And an additional part for me that is quite important is this notion that we're in a process with something. I don't like one-offs. Precisely because if something comes up during that one session that either damages or it's a form of rupture between us or something within their internal system happens, then I want to be available for that over time, and not like, oh, we have one integration session left and we're barely going to talk about that because it's such a big thing. So a lot of your question I would answer in the terms of, how much work do you do with them in advance? Like, how safe are they already with you? I know I think we spoke last time. It's like, I know you do a lot of that, right? I'm saying more in a general sense of like, how much work are we doing with a client? How safe are they? How comfortable are they with expressing yeses or nos that they feel in their body? How much do you know as a practitioner about their embodied responses or their somatic patterning? So how well are you aware through being with them sober to the minute, the extremely subtle changes in their soma that tell you that there might be an override happening or another part or some blended or dissociation happening? How attuned are you to that? How much permission do you have to make interventions? How much did you communicate about that in advance? How much informed consent is there? So that's the entire pre-process. And then in the session itself, yeah, when we have a well-informed hunch and we have a foundation of consent, we might try to do something and get it wrong. The thing that I tend not to do is try to solve in the moment. I also, having perfectionist parts, didn't like that I got it wrong. I see that I did something. I realized that that was probably an intervention I shouldn't have done. And now I also need to just sit that out with them, with my discomfort. And can I hold that? Can I can connect to the healing impulse. I can connect to, I had a good intention here, but I see that the impact is different. Like, how much self-soothing can I do in that moment? How well regulated can I stay and attune to the other person? And then when sobriety comes, like landing comes, first to check in if it actually, did I actually get it right? Did I actually rightly observe that I got it wrong, is what I'm trying to say. Because that too can be an assumption, right? We have these weird coincidences. So to actually check, and sometimes the client has already moved through it. They just didn't express that. They are now in a different place. I'm not a mind reader. I like to believe I can track where people are, but sometimes I'm miles off, like miles and miles away. And so I'm like, oh, is that what's been going on? I thought you had a relatively calm experience. No. It's just like I was torn up. And so to just check and then very slowly to work with a client. But I don't do any of that work when they're under the influence, unless they're suddenly very clear, challenge me or express concern, in which case, yeah, I'll work with it. So there's two things. If I'm in the process of, for example, hey, how would it be if I put my hand on your shoulder, right? Or depending on how we talked about that, I might do that. And then the moment I do, I might just check, how is that? And it can be, sometimes it's very subtle, right? Someone is like this, you do this, and it's like, and you just hear the exhale, and it's like, okay. But then still, after a moment, I might check, is this still okay? I don't do that in a group, right? That's a one-on-one context where there's that level of talking. In groups, I would prepare completely different. There's much more self-reliance. And then if people ask, they ask for an intervention. They ask for support. They raise their hand, they make eye contact, and it's rare for us to actually go to them and make an intervention. Because in most group processes that I'm involved in, at the very least, is in a religious community. So the whole setting is different. There's a completely different preparation, very little preparation. It's like you come, part of the practice is you keep showing up consistently, you keep coming back basically over time. So it's context dependent, it's dependent on what your agreement are, it's also dependent on like your competencies. Like, I feel comfortable with certain forms of somatic work and not with others. I'm not a Reiki practitioner, I'm not a psychoanalyst, I haven't been trained in psycholytic therapy, so I'm not going to be talking to someone when they're under the influence. Thank you for sharing. I'm very touched by what you just shared. This is, I think, going to the heart of the challenge. That practitioner might have been excellent for hours on end. We don't know. We could speculate, for example, that something you said provoke them with such a profound sense of being disturbed that they had a sort of like part come up. It's like, oh no, right? Which is zero to do with you. It impacts you profoundly though, right? And they're not aware of that. There's something else happening for them where, and this is why I really resonated with what Laura Northrup said at the beginning of that panel that I mentioned. The first thing that they articulated was so many people that call themselves healers need at least an additional 5 years of shadow work, therapy, self-reflection, because there's a lot of good weather trip sitters. It's like, if I work with a client that are fairly well integrated, things flow well. Give people MDMA, they're going to feel safe, right? That's part of, not always, but that's part of what the substance does. Yeah, they have a beautiful experience. They project it onto me. It's actually the LSD. I have some great LSD, right? Like, if you take that, you're going to have a great time. But then this person that gives that to you, you project it. And so some practitioners start to think, I'm good at this. And then the hallmark of a good practitioner is, can you stay attuned for 12 hours nonstop And notice that if this other person asks you, have you ever had something like this? And how fast that part can come up and just wants to take off, that you still know, ooh, I see you. Okay. Wow. I just realized that could also have happened to me. It didn't, but it could have happened to me. I was a child. I was vulnerable as a child. Someone could have taken advantage of me. Yes. And maybe if I say this right now, that could have impacted you in a way that was not wholesome. That could have spinned you off. So can I stay present to this? Can I create a context in which I'm sure that if something like that would happen, that you would still trust me, even after an initial override, to come back to me later and go like, Daan, that thing you said, initially I thought I was okay, but actually it was not okay. But I need relation with you over time. I need to be, available. And sometimes clients will test, right? We talked about that last time. They're just there. And so to not always take the bait and not become reactive also shows them that, we can have something. We're here. We're going to show up. It's okay. Yeah. Thank you for watching. If you've been watching this recording, this is part of the sort of facilitator circle that Nectara is currently building, and we're really trying to foster a sense of community with other practitioners, where we're really trying to have these deeper conversations. There's a sort of free trial right now, so if you've never been with Nectara and you're interested, then please consider this an opportunity to explore further. And this morning I had a conversation with one of the founders of Nectara, Pascal, and he said, if pricing is a challenge, try our new open door policy. You just tell us how much you're willing to or capable of kind of like contributing, and we'll make it work. So I wanted to end with that encouragement. And then Sarah, that is here, and Sandra are also part of Nectara and offering their own wisdom in different containers. Thank you for coming too. Sandra, thank you for helping. And I look forward to seeing all of you next time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.